Hello and welcome to my live stream, my monthly live stream from Helen Claire Gould. Glad you could join me. So tonight I'm going to start off with quite a serious subject which manifests itself in the form of The Night Nurse, which is a poem I wrote or got the idea for when I was in hospital a couple of years ago having my hip replacement after I broke it, which was not a clever thing to do. So this is The Night Nurse. The night nurse wears depravity among vermilion smiles in Libya, Syria, Yemen, and the Palestinian hills. She wears it with pride, without hesitation, and defiles the profession she represents within these ancient piles. She's not here to help you, O sick and injured child. She's here to gratify herself and fill her pockets with denials. She knows her fate is coming soon, and in a little while she'll be here, awaiting it, as bombs fall from starless skies. But she thinks she'll get away with it and carry on until she's unmasked, caught red-handed, dismissed and led to trial. The pilot's out there waiting. He's loaded up his files. He has her in his sights tonight. And never mind the child that clings around her knees and cries. He's just collateral. His urge to live is strong, but danger lives within that smile for reasons too. It's not just you. Your fate is his as well. It won't be long before the missiles open up the miles between the launch window and the patient portent trials, predicting the prognosis for this hospital on wheels. It looks just like an accident, unfortunate and vile, an incident of friendly fire, where workers in the field, though there to help, were targeted, thanks to what was revealed. Yet, was it right to take her out with her human shield of children needing surgery or food or shots or pills? They don't deserve to die, hostage to unreason, deadly ills, hatred, blind prejudice and abuse. When she was hired to provide the love and TLC they need, their fate was sealed. Her history of sex abuse, her neglect and games so cruel, fingers shut in deliberate doors, cigarette burns hammering the nails. She blamed it on her partner, the death of her own child. She's free as air to carry on, while he now rots in jail. The lies and power play over victims, those things she concealed at interview and vetting time to get work in the field. This aid worker's agenda was to abuse those in her care, the orphans, bomb blast victims, rape survivors, boys and girls. She took them all to hell with her when retribution for these ills came a-knocking at the door one night, when skies were filled with cluster bombs and smoke and fire and innocent blood was spilled. And yes, she avoided justice, which would have taken her to trial for perpetrating atrocities which just betrays her guile. The selfish self-gratification of self-imposed exile is trumpeted loud and clear within that cold vermilion smile. Thank you so much. So we're going to make the tone a little bit lighter now, as I'm going to read you a piece that I quite often read from the Stallion, which is my little book. It was on the outskirts of the souk that I first glimpsed it. Pure white, a stallion, flared nostrils exhaling steam. Elemental, a figure out of the foundry of hell itself. It trotted past the great trunks of the Caliban trees, weaving a pattern between them that paralleled their movements. Its eyes glinted red and wild in the sunlight, meeting mine with a knowing gleam and innate insolence. My pulse flared and the blood trembled in my veins, yet I couldn't look away. Despite my fear, the horse's beauty caught at my heart. The grey disappeared around the edge of the forest where the Calibans grew more thickly, and for several moments I stood staring after it. I remember that morning well. I drew the Gra mule to a post sunk in the ground, hobbled it with the halter, and stood watching it. A blast of heat and light struck me as one of the nearby Calibans shifted. I fanned myself with my hands. The Gra mule gave me a long stare, then turned away to munch on tough brownish stalks, the nearest equivalent of grass on Thargos 4. It bore little resemblance to terrestrial grass. Leafless, it had only stalks and roots. On the way back to my father's stall, I passed old Sadiq. His forehead and crooked nose bore several horseshoe-shaped imprints, and the keffiyeh which framed his face did nothing to cover the scars or opaque pupils. As usual, a crowd of children were gathered around him to hear his stories. Even adults at nearby stalls paid him attention between customers. I'd listened too, many times, to stories about the landing, stories of desert creatures of old Earth that nobody really believed in anymore, to 100 tales of echoes of the past. Things none of us could imagine. The most popular stories with children were about this land. I caught a snatch of the story. I was a horse handler, the best while I still had my eyes. That's why I came here, to care for the horses we brought with us. My footsteps slowed. It was a tale I'd never heard before. But the ship was damaged on arrival, and horses are sensitive animals. Of all the things they dislike about starships, being suddenly released from stasis after a trip is the worst. So as I led the first screaming animal from the stalls and down the ramp, the creature bucked and stood nigh upright. He was a great stallion, with the purest white coat I'd ever seen. And I'd seen a lot of horseflesh, and his eyes were pale and without pigmentation, a manifestation of a mutated virus from the frontier planets. But as he glared at me, they were red with fear and anger. My last sight was of his hooves striking for my face. Then the pain came, and I crouched on the ramp. My hands covered my broken face while his hoofbeats thundered into the distance, and 100 horses streamed after him into the desert. I was lucky not to be trampled to death in the stampede. Sadiq sucked in a quivering breath. For a moment I feared he wouldn't be able to continue speaking. But after a convulsive swallow, he continued. Nearly all the horses escaped with that grey, so there are few in Adiba now, and most of the traders. Here Sadiq waved a hand at the stalls around him, despite his inability to see them. Well, don't your fathers use the lizards as pack mules? Yes, and much trouble they are too, someone muttered nearby. Children giggled. Sadiq waited till the chuckles subsided before speaking again. And so we've learned to associate the return of the horses with the return of the ships. I remembered then that I was on an errand for my father. As Sadiq began a new tale, I wandered back to the stall. The sun rode higher in the sky, and its heat drummed at my temples. But as I threaded between booths near the outskirts of the bazaar, where Calibans and bare red earth gave way to native grasses, I saw that stallion. And Sadiq's story came back to me. I let out a shuddering sigh, blinked moisture from my eyes, and hastened my steps. Father had already laid everything out. On the stall, shaded by hides nailed to a wooden frame, lay great piles of tooled and plain leatherwork, the little bags for carrying the Quran, belts, purses, sandals, shoes and boots, these last nearly tall enough to keep the fine quartz grains from sifting between the toes to chafe them. There were supple leathern cloaks and scabbards for the curved swords, relics of the old days on earth that some of the men still wore. Where were you, boy? Father growled. Tethering the mule. I injected innocence into my words. I wasn't ready to share my vision of the horse with him, nor would I have revealed my earlier fancy that the Calibans were trying to tell me something. He'd laugh or say I was daydreaming. I've been asked by the teacher to find out if your son's here again, Ms. Amil. We both turned. The superintendent always rode a bay horse with a regretful air. I was near enough to smell leather polish and sweat. The mare gazed at me, flicking her black tail to dislodge grazing insects, and I realised for the first time that her expression echoed her rider's. I do hope you're not encouraging Bashir to miss his schooling so that he can help you on the stall again. No, not at all, Father lied. The mare returned her reproachful gaze on him. I'm glad to hear it, said the superintendent, and walked his mount away from our stall. He was a man of power, the source of order within our community, the possession of a horse his badge of office. I gazed after him for a moment, envying him the bay, and yet not, for she could in no way stand up to comparison with the magnificence of the white stallion, though I was almost sure that I'd dreamed that creature after all. You'd best get to school then, son, said my father. Don't forget this. He took a pocket-sized copy of the Quran from its leather bag around his neck, kissed it and handed it to me. To protect it, he'd bound it in fine leather he'd cured himself. I took it and kissed it. Then he handed me the bag from round his neck. I shortened the strap and slipped it over my neck, then slid the holy book back in the bag so that it lay against my heart. Beside me, Father spotted a potential customer and yelled, Fine leathers! I turned to go. Hooves pounded the earth as the white stallion thundered round the end of the stall. It stood before me for a moment and pondered the wares laid there. Then its eyes rode across the stall to Father, then to me. An unnatural hush fell on the marketplace. In the distance, a child cried. I dared not move. The great horse's flanks expanded. Its wild spirit and nobility filled those eyes, red and slitted. They reflected the sun in the clearing. The marketplace rabble receded. For a moment, there was only myself and the stallion in the souk, boy and horse juxtaposed, the wild and free against the chained. Then it drew itself in. Determination filled its eyes. It moved closer. It was huge. I stepped back involuntarily as I remembered how Sadiq had lost his sight. I held up my hands in a warding gesture. A pang tightened my stomach. It shook its head. Its silky mane flew in several directions at once, though the air was still. Its breath was hot on my skin. I turned and ran. The holy book bumped against my breast. I laid a hand against it to protect it. In between stalls and people I dodged, round a fruit booth. Rich scents of peaches and dates mingled in my nostrils. My arm caught a basket. Melons thudded on the ground. Hoofbeats clattered behind me. I dared not check how close the horse was. I spun to my right and pushed between traders. One of them shouted. No doubt he thought it a child's game. Ahead, people jumped back. I wasn't sure if they sought to avoid me or the stallion. The hoofbeats were louder now. Terror invaded me. To my right was a stall crammed with brasswares. I sensed sanctuary within the frame, twisted and dropped to the ground, wriggled between the planking and curled up, and hoped the stallion wouldn't see me in the gloom. Through a gap in the drapes, I saw the stallholder's ankles. He stood before his stall. Only 18 credits for this phase. Too much at that. The stallion skidded to a halt that scuffed up a cloud of sand by the stall. His head swung from side to side. He still sought me. I felt his presence. Can he sense mine? The idea panicked me. There was a crash from behind as the stallion reared up and kicked at the booth. I crept towards the light at the other end of the frame. If I can escape without him noticing... But as I squirmed back into daylight, the stallion awaited me. I backed away and dashed towards father's stall. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the superintendent ride up to a trader and shout something. The man nodded and turned away. I hardly had time to think. At my back, I felt a stall's planks and smelled the reek of leather. I'd gone round in a circle. Someone screamed. Father was on his knees. He wrung his hands before the great horse. His lips moved. But I couldn't hear what he was saying. I turned to face the stallion. His breath on my skin was hotter than the sun. The sounds of the marketplace receded, replaced by a sense of isolation from the rest of humanity. The stallion stood regarding me with that same quizzical look of reproach that the bay had worn. The superintendent dared not approach. I knew I had to get away from this insane creature. Surely he intended to kill me, or at least maim me as he had Sadiq. I thought to climb one of the trees. But what if it moves as I climb? But the top of our stall was sturdy enough. Dead Caliban wood was forever stilled. I scrambled upwards. From my vantage point, I looked around. I remember the brass nails in the top of the stall, holding planks and skins together. The smell of leather and sweat hung raw and crude in the air, like distant battle smoke. I couldn't see father. He must have fled. The stallion nudged the planking. I felt it shake and settle again. I clung to the frame. The stallion reared and struck the stall with hooves that glistened in the sunlight. Leather tore, the lower planks split like matchwood. My heart jerked. I clung to the centre frame. I pulled myself astride it. I crouched, unable to move anywhere. I was trapped. In the background, a voice repeated the same phrases over and over, but I couldn't make any sense of the words. The carpet booth stood hard by our stall. It was just near enough to pull myself over. I wriggled along the centre frame. At the end, I cast a look at the great white horse. He stared back at me. I gathered myself up. I grabbed for the next stool top as I tried to escape the fate this creature had decided for me. All the while, I held his gaze. My hands struck the centre frame. They bounced off, numb. I discovered then that Caliban wood was hard as iron, even cushioned with leather. I lost my grip and slid down the shade. My world narrowed down to a sheet of red leather, to clawing for scale-barked wood with hands that didn't quite work, to listening between gasps for the hiss of breath and the sound of hooves. But I heard other sounds, the creak of leather and swish of fabric as men moved, a clash of metal followed by a curse, arrows knocked to bows, swords slid from scabbards. Understanding came. They're going to kill the stallion. Fear and sorrow overwhelmed me. His beauty had captured my soul despite Sadiq's loss. Ready? That one word was clear, even against the background jabber of the souk. Swoosh! An arrow slit the air. It buried itself in the wood, not an arm's length below me. The shock ran through the stall frame. I turned to face the superintendent's men. Leather split under my weight. Appalled, I slid earthwards. The wooden edge of the stall caught under my arms, and the jolt numbed my shoulders and winded me. My legs dangled in the air. I realised the voice I heard was father's as he prayed. The white stallion shrieked to protest and thundered towards the archers. I heard them scatter. There were more hoofbeats. Teeth closed on my leg. I knew fear and expected pain. Strangely, none came, though the stallion had gripped my leg in his mouth. I dared to look at him as he tugged at the limb. His eyes were white too, but hot as ever, fuelled by desperation. That made us equals, each in our own way. The stallion released my leg. I felt his nose against me, exploring. He passed alongside, nudging me, and held my gaze with a look as purposeful as any man's. Of a sudden, I realised I'd misunderstood his intention all along. Weak with relief, I allowed myself to drop onto his back. I bent my head to his ear and whispered, "What is it that you want?" I caught a glimpse of father, crouched near the ruin of our stall. My cloak was folded up in his arms. Nearby, the superintendent's men regrouped. There were shouts from them. Ride this way, Bashir. Ride him over here. Now they planned to trap the stallion, I realised. I held up my hands, to which awareness was flowing back in painful pulses to stop the archers from shooting. It's all right, I called. Put down your bows and arrows. He means me no harm. My father's voice was louder than the rest. Bashir, come here, son. He ran towards me, but two of the superintendent's men grabbed him. He struggled in their grip. Curse you, man, I want my boy safe. Let me get to him. He freed himself from one man with a punch, but the other held on tight. Don't be a fool, Muzamil. That's a rogue horse there. The stallion drew in a lungful of hot air and whinnied a protest. He gave me no time to regain strength in my hands. We were away. I clung to his mane and lay low against his neck. Not even the superintendent dared follow us. We headed out into the desert, away from the Calibans. The sun bombarded us with heat and dust. The great horse thundered along beneath me. After a while, his hooves no longer sounded like steps, just urgent drumbeats. I narrowed my eyes against the wind. The dunes blurred red around me. My hands had passed through the stages of numbness and pain and arrived at a place where only occasional hot needles stabbed them. Thank you so much for that. I hope you enjoyed it. And to finish up, I'm going to read another poem, which is a bit more light-hearted again after the darkness of that aid worker. Ooh, she's a naughty bit of work. Right, so this is a case of mistaken identity, which was written a long time ago, quite a few years ago, for one of the poetry evenings at, I can't remember what, oh yeah, Right Club, that's it, Right Club. It was written for Right Club, and that was one of the evenings at the stonemasons. It seems so long ago and so far away now. Okay. One day I was at the museum chatting to the guy at the desk regarding an upcoming fiction fixture and a workshop on what to do next. Can I put my flyers and leaflets in the restaurant and gallery? I said to the guy, and when he asked why, they always do this for me. Now, I'm not too bad at faces, and I'm generally goodish at names. The problem I find is not mixing them up when my mind starts playing games. So I don't make mistakes very often and assign the wrong name to a face, but my brain might be starting to soften when I meet friends out of place. Now, sometimes I look at a person and it's not who I think standing there. So embarrassing when you say hello to a person who just gives you a stare. There's only 11 facial types, scientists say, and it must be true. It's like a face fitted over the one that I thought I knew. A lady I know who works there came out into the foyer. I saw her and said, "Hello, Lucy." She said, "You'll hear from my lawyer." I thought she looked a lot younger and wondered how that could be. She must have bought a good facelift, I thought, though it seemed incredible to me. I knew that Lucy had had a date with a man from the NHS, but was it his fate, these traits to create and deliver relief from distress? She said, "Helen, it's Jen," and flounced out the door. I watched her depart with a sinking heart and retrieved my jaw from the floor. A few days later, I rang Jen. We met at college, you see. I suggested we meet. She said, "It would be sweet to renew your acquaintance with me." So we met in Bewitched Coffee Bar, and this is how it ends. I said, "I'll explain. I've a sieve-like brain. So forgive and forget and be friends." She sent me a card at Christmas. I sent her one as well. Our relationship seems to be all right now, as far as I can tell. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching and listening. and I hope you've enjoyed those little peeks into my world. And I look forward to seeing you for Fiction Fix on Sunday, which will be live streamed to Facebook, in the Finger on the Pulse. I believe on my timeline, and the video will be posted on my YouTube channel, Helen Claire Gould, afterwards. So I look forward to seeing you then, guys. Cheers. Bye.